Alright guys, Murphs here, and today we're going to go over, by viewer request, how to shoot a revolver. Now, this might be kind of odd because revolvers seem very simple and there's not a whole lot of context that has to be thrown into how to shoot them. However, if you're talking about shooting a revolver defensively, it's actually kind of an involved process. It requires a slightly different application of technique than what you would typically find in a semi-auto. So it is definitely something that has to be talked about. Now, there's a lot of things that we have to talk about before we get into the full-on subject of this video. First off, for the most part, revolvers have fallen out of favor as defensive type firearms. In a professional capacity, you're very seldom going to see revolvers in anyone's holsters. Militaries are not adopting, for the most part, new revolvers. Law enforcement agencies have gone away from revolvers starting in the 90s. So the revolver, the combat magnum as we've known it, something like a Smith & Wesson Model 686, is not necessarily a practical everyday carry type option for people who don't believe that concealed carry constitutes wearing a loose-fitting outer garment like, I don't know, a fly fishing vest or something like that over top of their outside-the-waistband handgun. The vast majority of people today are carrying snub-nose revolvers, if they're carrying revolvers at all. Now, this gets into a really interesting discussion, which can kind of almost be its own video by itself, over suboptimal versus optimal. Now, in the current manner of how we train, of how it is that we prepare for gunfights with current technology and current procedures and all that kind of stuff, for the most part, all of that is geared towards semi-automatics, and that is because semi-automatics carry more ammunition. They are easier and faster to be able to change magazines. They're easier to be able to clear malfunctions and all that type of stuff. There's a lot of advantages that come with a semi-automatic pistol. That is the optimal option at that point, be it a Glock 19 or a 43X or a SIG P365, whatever it is that you pick. Those are what are considered to be the trendy, acceptable offerings. However, revolvers, while not optimal, still fall into the suboptimal category, which means that yes, I am accepting some inefficiencies with this particular handgun, but if I learn how to master it, it will still do what I expect it to have to do. So where, yes, carrying a Glock 19 with a Surefire X300 and a Trichcon RMR on top of it and, 4 magazines and all this kind of crazy stuff is going to allow you to be able to take on that motorcycle gang of clown spider women. But the more likely engagement of maybe 2 people and a couple of shots being fired are more than adequately going to be covered by a revolver. Now the issue becomes complex simplicity, which is a term that I use on the channel, but I haven't done so in a while. Now, complex simplicity is when you have a very simple item, but in order to be able to run it effectively or in a modern sense, you're going to have to do more manipulations. You're going to have to take more special considerations in order to be able to work around that handgun, rifle, shotgun, whatever it is that it may be. There's a tendency for us to believe that simple systems are really easy to use, and that is not the case. If you look at an AK, the overall operating principle of an AK is pretty simple. You got a bolt that goes back and forth. You got a gas piston that's acted upon by gases. You got a spring that pushes everything back to where it goes. You got a big charging handle to grip and rip on, and a big old safety. That's simple. Yes, but if you start talking about trying to run it fast, trying to run it efficiently, trying to run it tactically, an AK is actually really difficult to do all that with. Now, you hand that to some poor dumb farmer in whatever country, he's going to be able to figure out how to work it really quickly. But he will not run it as efficiently with the same amount of training as somebody who's running an AR-15. He's going to need more training. He's going to need more time. He's going to need more ammunition. It's the same type of thing whenever we talk about revolvers. Yes, they are very simple. And there's a automatic expectation that simplicity is going to mean reliable. But when revolvers fail, they fail big time. Especially, it's probably going to be ammunition related or something along those lines. A couple years ago, I had a squib load in an old box of wad cutters that I was shooting out of one of my snub noses, and the bullet did not make it into the barrel, but it did make it into the forcing cone and not completely out of the cartridge casing. So I had to hammer the cylinder open in order to shear the projectile so that I could get the cartridge out and punch the remainder of the projectile out of the forcing cone. That's a catastrophic failure. There's no coming back from that. That tap rack bang or any other type of immediate action is not going to correct it. That gun is out. And if you don't have a second gun, you're in big trouble. Kind of a New York Reload type situation. We'll cover that more here in a bit, probably. Now, I've also seen bullet creep, which you'll find this a lot in your like super lightweight options, like your Smith & Wesson 638s or 642s, the air weight snub-nosed revolvers, to where as you fire the gun, the cylinder has more and more difficulty turning, and that is because the projectiles in the remaining cartridges are starting to walk out of the cartridge casings and are starting to rub against the frame and the forcing cone and all that type of stuff as the cylinder turns. That's an issue. It's actually more common than you might think in a lot of these lighter weight handguns, so that's something you have to pay attention to. Now, that doesn't stop the gun from working as much as it's going to massively increase your trigger pull. It's going to massively increase your effort in order to be able to fire the gun, which is going to negatively impact your accuracy. So these are the type of things that kind of run a revolver towards being suboptimal. That's not to say that they can't do the work, as much as it is to say that you need to be on top of it. And one of the biggest issues with the shooting public in general is that the vast majority of people do not train with their defensive firearm that much, which really means that they have a very inaccurate estimation of their proficiency and their readiness for the fight. However, I actually shoot and train with revolvers quite frequently because I carry snub-nosed revolvers quite frequently. Revolvers like this Smith & Wesson Model 36, Chambered in .38 Special, which will be the topic of today's video. I actually carry this revolver pretty much every weekend, where I do the vast majority of my concealed carrying to begin with. And it is one of my favorite snub-nosed revolvers to shoot. And we're going to kind of talk about some of the attributes of this handgun as we go through this that make it a successful snub-nosed revolver and things that you might want to look at upgrading about your own revolver as you go along. All right, so first off, let's go ahead and talk about revolver sights. For the most part, revolvers have either these type of fixed combat sights, which this is a gutter rear sight with a blade type front sight, or you'll have adjustable sights. On defensive type firearms, I'm not a big fan of adjustable sights, just because they're fragile. There's a possibility that they could get bumped or they could get damaged in a scuffle for your firearm. I remember a couple years ago, a former police officer telling a story about how he got into a scuffle with a suspect and he got hit with a 2x4, and the 2x4 caught him across the side and actually broke the rear sight off of his revolver. That is potentially problematic had he pulled that gun and tried to use it, especially if he had to shoot at any distance. These sights will most definitely hold up. However, one of the issues, especially on these older types of revolvers, but new ones have this as well, is that you don't have a lot of contrast between your front sight and your rear sight, which will make night fighting very problematic. And also, it being a revolver, I can only really think of a handful of revolvers in the world that have any type of rail to be able to attach a light, so that's going to further complicate your night fighting capability. One of the big things, one of the key plug-and-play aspects of your concealed carry gun is that it needs to be functional in all lighting conditions and situations. This is one of the things that keep revolvers solidly in the suboptimal category. Now, you can get revolvers that have replaceable front sights, so that you could put in like an XS Big Dot or something like that and work around at least something with more contrast, or perhaps find something out there that has some tritium night sights in it, or whatever it is that it may be. But you have to find a revolver that matches that. Now, one of the next big things is going to be barrel length. This is a 3-inch barrel, and this handgun is actually really easy to draw and conceal carry and all that kind of stuff, as well as being relatively accurate. However, when you go with the shorter barrels, sometimes things can get a little bit squirrely. Your sight radius is much shorter, and when you already have these kind of crude sights and all that kind of stuff, that's not going to be very helpful to the overall shooting engagement and being successful in winning your fight. Something to keep in mind here, guys. You can only shoot as fast as you can read your sights, or you should only shoot as fast as you can read your sights. And this is so that you make sure that you're hitting your intended target and not turning this justified shoot into a murder trial. So it's a key thing, and that's why you got to train and work around your guns as much as you can. I have a shorter 1 7/8 inch version of this very same gun that I am also supremely confident in concealed carrying, because I have no trouble hitting targets with that revolver. Now, keep in mind, guys, my confidence level with this revolver is incredibly high. I actually shot my local PD's qualification with this handgun and passed it. So if I was a police officer where I am now, aside from the fact that I'm pretty sure that they don't authorize revolvers for duty carry, I could feasibly carry this revolver. Now, let's go ahead and talk about single action triggers. Now, one of the great things about revolvers is that you can fire this in either double action or single action. However, there's a couple things we got to talk about, because quite often you'll see a lot of guys out on the range shooting these guns single action because it is easier to shoot single action accurately than it is double action. However, if you're talking about not just using this as a range toy, you've got to figure out how to work this double action trigger, because the issue with the single action trigger is that this trigger is light. It is incredibly light, and as much as the safest way to handle any handgun is to keep your finger straight up until you're ready to fire. One of the things with manipulating super light triggers is that you increase the possibility of discharging a round earlier than you wanted to. Now, that doesn't mean that your single action trigger should be 8 pounds or something along those lines, as much as you might need to get comfortable with the double action trigger in order to be able to safely and effectively engage with this handgun. So, in the 1930s, officers were trained to shoot in single action. I consider that completely pointless when it is much faster to be able to use the double action, and potentially safer for bystanders, not so much the guy that you're shooting at. So, with that being the case, how do you handle the double action trigger, Murph? Well, before we get into the trigger, we should probably first talk about grip. Now, on a semi-automatic, we would try to get this really aggressive thumbs forward grip and all that kind of stuff. However, there's a couple of issues with doing that with a revolver. First off, we have the cylinder that is going to rotate as the gun cycles. In addition to that, we have our cylinder gap, which is the space between the forcing cone and the cylinder itself. There's a lot of flame and stuff that comes out of this whenever it fires. A lot of hot gases and stuff like that get vented off. Those are not going to feel good on your hand. And if the gun's powerful enough, they're going to rip some skin off of your hand. So with revolvers, you actually want to have your grip come back over top of your firing hand. Your support hand comes back over top of the firing hand. And I like to put thumb on top of thumb. Now, the next thing, now we can go ahead and start talking about the double action trigger pull. Here's the deal. Just like any other trigger pull, you want to make sure that your squeeze is consistent and to the rear. You don't want to see a bunch of movement in your sights and all that kind of stuff as you cycle this trigger. But just as important as the squeeze, so is your follow through and your let go, your release. So all of that needs to be controlled even as you increase the pace of shooting. So that's one of the measures that I look for whenever it is that I'm training with this revolver, if I'm doing dry fire practice or something along those lines, is throughout the cycle of the trigger stroke, do my sights move? Ideally, they should not. The only time my sights should move is whenever this gun is under recoil. And then I'm actively working to try to get back on my sights and back on the target and all that kind of stuff. So, the squeeze, follow through, and release are all vital portions of the double action trigger pull. And it doesn't matter how fast it is that you're going, all this kind of stuff. Now, some people like to talk about getting all the way back to just before the point of release and then letting that trigger go. That is a method. However, if you're trying to go fast, you're going to be better served getting that full stroke through the trigger squeeze, not necessarily pausing right before let off. Especially since if you're trying to shoot fast and do that type of shooting, you're going to wind up throwing shots because you're going to eventually power through that hesitation prior to let off. So just go ahead and take an active role in controlling that trigger squeeze as you go. So don't be scared of your double action triggers on defensive firearms. Make sure that you're training with them every opportunity that you get. Now, some people will say, well, if you're going to take a long shot or something like that, you're going to want to go ahead and cock the hammer. Yes, that is an option. However, they're going to be few and far between in self-defense type circumstances where it's going to be acceptable for you to take a long shot and it still be considered self-defense. So keep that in mind as well. I'm not saying don't prepare for it as much as I'm saying that if I'm going to preference my time, the vast majority of my time is going to be on getting rounds down range in double action at relatively close or the accepted self-defense distances that everybody talks about. All right, now let's talk about the grips themselves. As we can see, this actually has quite large grips on it. The vast majority of snub-nose revolvers out there have very short grips. This becomes a very conscious trade-off between having something be easy to conceal and having something be easy to shoot. The vast majority of concealed carry owners, people who do in fact practice self-defense and carry their handguns consistently, are going to spend a lot more time carrying their handgun than they're actually going to spend shooting it. So I would not necessarily preference having a large grip on your carry gun, because you do need it to be concealed. One of the key aspects of being concealed is making sure no one else knows that you have it. So making sure that you're not printing or something along those lines is an active portion of self-defense type concepts and strategies. However, I would also understand somebody wanting to put a larger grip on their revolver in order to better be able to manage recoil and all that kind of stuff. So if the handgun is uncomfortable for you to shoot, if it moves around your hand too much and you're having difficulty getting fast, good groupings at combat distances, 5 to 7 yards, then you may need to look into putting a larger grip on your gun and then maybe having to change how you dress a little bit in order to be able to accommodate that. That is a very personal choice right there. That is something that is driven by necessity, not something that anybody else tells you to do, as much as to tell you that it's acceptable to have to do so. Set the conditions for success. Set your conditions for success. So if you got to carry a little bit larger butt on your gun, then dress accordingly so that you don't tip anybody else off that you're carrying and potentially lose your element of surprise in a violent encounter. Now, reloads. Reloads are one of the biggest portions of discussion whenever it is that we're talking about revolvers, because the issue with revolvers is kind of like shotguns, is keeping them plussed up in the fight. Because regardless of what it is that you have going on, if you fire rounds, you need to be ready to reload. That's where tack magging in semi-automatic handguns comes in and all that kind of stuff. Okay, I fired a couple of rounds, I've got a lull in the fighting, I'm not actively being engaged or engaging anybody else. I'm going to go ahead and change that magazine real quick so that I've got plenty of rounds on board should the fight start back up. With revolvers, it's a little more difficult. Now, for decades, police officers carried cartridge pouches, which had a whole bunch of 38 rounds in it. And they would open it, and then it would be like a dump pouch type setup, or have, bullet loops or something along those lines. And then they would subscribe to and follow the shoot to, load to methodology, which was you would engage whatever targets with 2 rounds, and then as circumstances allowed, you would pop open your cylinder, lightly depress the plunger, so that the live rounds would fall back into it, but the expended cartridges would stick out of the cylinder face so that you could pull those out and then load into additional rounds, close up your cylinder, and then be ready to get back into the fight. That is a method, but it's not my favorite method, especially if you have, that's fine for plussing up. You fired a couple of rounds out of your cylinder and you want to go ahead and reload and be ready for the next fight. However, if you're talking about emptying the whole cylinder, that's a long time to go from empty to loaded. So that is why I prefer speed type loaders. There's 2 different methods that you can use. You have speed loaders, which are the more popular and more often discussed option. This is an HKS speed loader right here. And then you have speed strips, this one from Bianchi. Between the two, when it comes to the concealed carry, I actually prefer speed strips. And that is because speed loaders, especially on your much smaller snub-nose revolvers that have like kind of chunky grips, speed loaders can be difficult to get into the chambers of the cylinder, and also difficult to get out of the way afterwards. So it can actually kind of slow you down on the reloads. I've timed myself. Speed strips are a little bit faster in the best circumstance, not that much slower in the worst circumstance. So the idea being here is that you would have live rounds on this. You could do the shoot to, load to with this, whereas with a speed loader, it's all or nothing. However, with a speed strip, you can go ahead, do shoot to, load to, so you can eject a little bit, preference the number, or extend the number of rounds that you want to reload, strip those off in the chamber, close up the revolver, and you're ready to go. as well as being able to strip these off in pairs in the cylinder until you're fully loaded and ready to get back into your fight. The other thing that I like about speed strips over speed loaders is that this sits flat in a pocket. So I can be dressed how I am right now, and I can put this in my shirt pocket, I can put this in the coin pouch on my pants or something along those lines, and it doesn't really stick out. Whereas speed loaders, being very round like they are, they can really stick out if you don't have like a coat pocket or something like that to throw them into. If you throw them into your pants pocket, people will notice that you got something in there. You know, is that a speed loader? You're just happy to see me type of deal. Now, when it comes to the reload, if I reload from empty, I'm going to engage my cylinder release, and then I'm going to use my support hand to press out the cylinder. Then I rotate the gun up, bring my dominant hand, and smack the ejector rod, which is going to, with the assistance of gravity, send all of my empties down on the ground. Then I secure my source of feed, be it my speed strip or my speed loader, whichever, load the gun, close the cylinder, rebuild my grip, and get back into the engagement. Now, I have seen some people express the idea of utilizing your dominant hand to conduct your reloads, like maintaining control with your dominant hand in order to eject your rounds and then do all your reloading with your non-dominant hand. I'm not a big fan of this because it's kind of complicated manipulations that I'm having my non-dominant hand do. Whereas here, yes, this is very much so gross movement, and I do break my grip in order to be able to do this, but I feel like and it's more manipulations, but it's more manipulations in order to quickly get to the end state instead of trying to do these manipulations with something that's not as proficient at the task. So yes, I turn it into gross motor movements to get back on track. It works for me. I feel very comfortable with doing it and can readily and quickly employ it on demand. Now, there is another option aside from speed loaders and speed strips, and that is moon clips, which you have to make sure that you have a cylinder that is cut in order to be able to receive moon clips. So this one is not. However, Smith & Wesson does make guns that are. And those, you eject the old, slap in the new, they're very thin and all that kind of stuff. It's very easy to be able to fit them into the cylinder, and then you get back into your engagement. That is an option as well if your cylinder is actually cut for it. And it would be pretty fast to boot. Biggest issue with them is that if you're training with it a lot, those little clips will bend or something along those lines, and they're not terribly expensive. You just have to make sure that you have plenty on hand. All right, guys. That's how to engage with, or that's how to shoot a revolver, at least in a defensive type sense. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.